Hello, this is Kevin Klinkenberg. Thanks for signing up. Thanks for listening. This is a terrific interview today with Steve Mouzon, who I find to be one of the more interesting people in the field of architecture and urban design. And we go a lot of different places that I think you'll enjoy. I do want to highlight this. There are some audio issues with the interview. This is still my first couple of episodes, so I'm working through those issues. The good news is I've already figured out what went wrong on this episode, and I'll be able to correct those for future podcasts. But please be patient with me, and I appreciate you working through this and listening anyway, because it's really a terrific interview, and I'll certainly have Steve back again at a future date. With that, thanks for listening, and enjoy the show. Welcome, everybody, to the Messy City podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Klinkenberg. Today, we are fortunate to be joined by Steve Mouzon. Steve is somebody I've known for a long time. He leads his own firm called Mouzon Design. Steve, you've done so much over the years that it's kind of hard to encapsulate it all. I even actually took the step of going to your website to try to look up some biographical information and summarize, but I just say, and you can add anything you want here. You're a lifelong practicing architect and urban designer. You've written multiple books. You co-created the New Urban Guild. You are a bit of an obsessive photographer and documenter of places and buildings. And you're a very active social media and new media advocate. So I guess the question is, Steve, what haven't you done?
I'm working on that right now. And by that, I mean that there's some, with all the books that I've written, I don't know, dozen, 15, something like that over the years, depending on what all you count. I think that the world is changing. And so what I'm trying to figure out now is what is the next best thing for what used to be a typical publication. And so that will be what I haven't done, but what I'm going to be doing is once I figure it out, then I'll do it. That's kind of that's kind of my MO is and I put it this way, and this is our actual I guess you call it our mission, but what we try to do, Wanda and I, is we try to find needs that aren't being yet met and figure out how to fill those needs, because the world doesn't need just one more architect or one more planner or one more whatever it is that any of us might be doing. What it needs is some of these critical needs being met that people aren't even seeing them until someone actually puts connects the dots and puts it all together and then says,
Mm-hmm.
Here, I can help with this. And so that's where we are. So we're kind of always a moving target, because what we were known for in 2005 is not what we're trying to figure out today, I guess you'd say.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to, as we get later into it, I want to talk about new media and some of the ways that you've shifted over the years. First, I want to make sure that people have an understanding of who you are and your background. It's interesting that when I did a quick Google search, I thought you should know that the address of your firm still comes up as Miami Beach. And I know that you're back in Tuscaloosa and have been for, a couple of years now? And Alabama is where you are from.
Right. We actually, I've been doing design review for almost 20 years here at the University of Alabama. I'd fly in one day a month and do the reviews, go back home. But in late 2018, well, it's actually August, the guy I work for here called up and says, Steve, how busy are you? And I said, what do you need? And he said, well, our longtime university planner has retired, and we need someone to be the interim planner until we can find a new permanent person. And so we cut a deal, and I came up here. I was thinking that there is no way, living in South Beach like we did for 17 years, that I would ever be able to live without my fix of urbanity. And so I negotiated to work 1 week on, 1 week off, and the week off, of course, I was back in Miami, and Wanda was still down there, which made sense. I didn't want to, not see her.
Mm-hmm.
And but that's 4.5 years later, and we're still here. So, and we actually sold our condo there. We had some concerns with things happening on the beach where they'd kind of lost their nerve to do some of the things that needed to be done for the future of the city. And so we were already looking for another place. We just never dreamed it would be here in Tuscaloosa. So,
Mhm.
but yeah, I, I'm still not an employee of the university. I'm a consultant, but this is this is our point of operations now, and it really is a fascinating little town to be in.
So why don't you talk a little bit about where you grew up and ultimately went to college? Also from a personal standpoint, I'm curious a little bit about your education as an architect and what that was like as you went through that period. If you had the same experience that most architects have, where you really were educated as a modern architect, as a modernist, so to speak, and how that went for you as a young adult.
Well, interestingly enough, Wanda and I got married after my first year in architecture school, and so she basically she kind of audited an architecture degree, you might say. She was up there, late at night in the studio helping me build models and stuff. She would go to all the juries and ask a bunch of questions afterwards. And the thing that changed uh, my career as much as anything in those early days was when she said one night we were in bed about to go to sleep, and she turned over to me and said, "Steve, why is it that you refuse to design anything that anyone else I love would love?" I said, "Well, do I?" She said, "Well, yeah." I said, "Well, how do you know?" She said, "Well, have you ever listened to non-architects talk about architecture?" I said, "No, we're told by our professors that we're supposed to educate the client." She said, "Well, if you would ever stop and listen, you might actually learn some things you don't already know." And so a big uh, a big chunk of my career for that thereafter has been all these decades since then. Has been trying to figure out what it is. Why is it that people will love certain things and not others, and how can we move the places we make and the buildings we build in the direction of places people love, as opposed to things that are just simply transactions that we throw away as soon as we can.
Did you have any professors? Were there any outlier professors or mentors in your younger years who would have embraced that approach? Who might have had a fondness for traditional architecture or classical architecture? Did you know anybody in that world at that time?
There were there were two professors in school, and there was one. Well, actually, two, three colleagues in school, but one in particular that comes to mind. One of the professors was Marvin Rosenman. He was head of the Department of Architecture, and he would celebrate any alternative uh, inquest that a student wanted to make. There were other professors that were trying to indoctrinate you as a Miesian or whatever, or a Corbusian, and but Marv would whatever people wanted to explore, he really encouraged that. And then the other guy was Dan Woodfin, and he had a strong background in Christopher Alexander in pattern language, and so there were a lot of things in there that when you're talking about a true living tradition of vernacular architecture, that really is the stuff that people love by definition. Otherwise, they wouldn't build it. When the townspeople build a town, they don't build stuff they hate. You know, um, and I mean that's kind of a truism, really, or should be. But and so he was very helpful as well. But the one student is a fellow named David Rao, who I believe you know.
Mm-hmm.
And David was always asking the questions that could not be answered uh, in that time and ever since, as long as I've known him. And uh, he was really a mind expanding agent for a number of us there in school that weren't just accepting the company line of Corbesian revival.
Mm-hmm. So I know I'm jumping around a little bit here, but I'm curious now with your experience as a consultant at the University of Alabama. What do you see in the architecture schools there and in the state and near the places you grew up and are familiar with? is it pretty much the typical architectural education that you see everywhere, or is there more impact from traditional architects?
Actually, here, University of Alabama does not have the architecture school in the state. There are
Okay.
actually two of them, one at Tuskegee University and the other at Auburn University. And
Okay.
I, I, I'm more familiar because I've gone there a couple of times and had more engagement with them with Auburn, and they're with the exception of um, there were a couple of professors over the years that have been uh, uh, real exceptions to the norm. But uh, I was down there a time or two as part of a jury, and uh, it was more just a typical education from what I could see, which was the same as what I had. It was very similar. It felt very familiar to my education at Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana, and so that was and then at Mississippi State, which is like only 90 miles away, uh, the Mississippi School of Architecture is there, and when I was there in the 90s and was uh, I was uh, interviewing students. You know, it was on the pro day or whatever they called it. Um, and the night before, there was a reception for the professionals, and the assistant dean at that time, he was making conversation, got around to me, asked me what we did and all that, and I mentioned our interest in the new urbanism, and I thought he was going to physically eject me from the building. Uh, he's long since gone, and there's a fellow named Fred Carl, who was a great hero of mine, that was heavily involved with the Mississippi Renewal Forum and the Katrina Cottages and all this. That Mississippi State now hosts the Fred Carl Small Town Center, which is doing a lot of really interesting things. Um, and it seems to me that the whole direction of the architecture program is, unlike a lot of places, the Mississippi State architecture program seems to have become a lot more open-minded since those days. But back in that day, one little quick story:
Mhm.
we went out for lunch and just decided we'd walk and find a place to eat. We happened to walk towards the town center. I didn't even know where that was at the time. Stumbled across this place called the Cotton District that was, it actually predated the new urbanism. It was the new urbanism beginning 10 years before Seaside began.
Mhm.
And so it's just a kind of proto new urbanism. And, and so just stumbling across this fascinating place. And then I got back in the afternoon interviews. I was all excited and stuff. And I was asking all the students, what do you know about the Cotton District? Every single one of them said, the what? They didn't know anything about it. It was a short walk from campus, and it was student housing. So at that time, the apparently the leadership in the school at that time had totally shut down any discussion of what Dan Camp was doing at the Cotton District. And but like I say, the school there has taken what appears to me to be a huge turn in the years since in a really good direction.
Yeah, that's so interesting. First of all, I'd forgotten you were Ball State, which was actually, believe it or not, on my short list of schools when I was looking to go to college, an architecture school. But your story reminds me a little bit of when I was an undergraduate at University of Kansas, and we a group of us did a spring break trip one year to Panama City, Florida, which is of course one of the big spring break destinations. So this was probably about 1991 or 92. And
Sure.
I had already learned at that time and read a little bit about Seaside. But most of our professors, if they knew about it, were pretty dismissive. So we actually, the group of us actually did the road trip, one day, did the very kind of nerdy architecture student thing and took the day off from hanging at Panama City Beach and drove to Seaside and walked around, which was, it was still a really small place at that time. But yeah, I had that experience of like, wow, what a remarkable thing. And, here's this incredible thing that we're not really being taught in architecture school. And it was very eye opening as a young person. I think it's really fascinating your conversation with Wanda too, because, I find that lay people who don't know much about architecture or architecture education, as most people wouldn't, are really surprised when they hear what it's actually like.
Yeah. Well, and there's one other thing I should throw in here as well, about uh, early formative influences. And this was on just a half an hour phone call. Maybe it's an hour. I can't remember. But one of the things that Marv Roseman did at Ball State is he started something called Lunchline, where any student who wanted to could come in and brown bag it, and we gathered around an old speakerphone, which literally looked like a speaker at a music event, and then it had a phone kind of the phone innards kind of screwed into the side of it or whatever, and we would call some famous architect. And this particular day, it was Michael Graves. And near the end of the conversation, um, there was a freshman that asked a typically freshman question. He said, "Mr. Graves, what is the secret of success in architecture?" Oh my goodness, he's going to just totally blow him off and such. But Graves was always a gentleman, and he said four words that changed my career, and it was extraordinary singleness of purpose.
Hmm.
Now, had he said wealthy parents, good political connections, going to the right church, being a good golfer, being good looking, or being charming, or athletic, or whatever, I had none of those things. But extraordinary singleness of purpose, I could just decide to have that,
Yeah.
and so that actually uh, his that actually was the key to. Well, I'll put it this way: when when um, when we begin to finally find some time digging out from under a mountain of debt of building this house that was our ideal dream, and it was self-sufficient homestead and all this, and that we had to finish on credit cards. But when we finally started to dig out of that by doing just a few little things like starting the catalog of the most loved places, since that time, based on his advice, in the years since 2003 when we moved to Miami Beach, technically I'm still an architect. Uh, but in those years since, which is now 20 years since the move this fall, um, I have not done anything that I was qualified to do. Everything I've done is things that I'm unqualified to do, but that nobody else is qualified to do either, because it's stuff that hadn't existed until now. And so, but it's all based on that idea of having an extraordinary singleness of purpose to go out there and, in our case, find needs that aren't being met and try to fill them. So that's kind of a weird little anecdote uh, but that I hope that might be helpful to someone else, because it certainly was helpful to me.
Well, I think it's a good segue to where I want to go next, which I think if I remember right, the first time we met was at a Seaside Institute forum in the early 2000s. In the seminars that Andreas and others and the Seaside Institute used to put together and lead, which really were remarkable
Yes.
sessions and a great way to train clients and potential clients and other designers and others who were just interested in new urbanism. So, what was it? How did you find yourself coming to that and coming to the new urbanism eventually?
Well, I had there was an article in Architecture Record that came out in April of 1981, I believe it was, or it may have been April of '82. Yeah, it would have been April of '82, about Seaside, the plan of Seaside. And up until that point, um, I had been really focused on, and this was before my work with Dan Woodfin, my thesis. He was my thesis advisor, but but I actually the uh, the day after Thanksgiving, 1980, uh, we went to uh, we'd had too much turkey the day before, so we said, let's go walk. Well, where can we walk? Well, I grew up in Sproul, so you can't walk there. But as a child, uh, my father had taken us, uh, Susan and Hazel and I, to this little hamlet just about 20 miles away called Mooresville, Alabama, because he loved the place. It was a classic old hamlet that was really the first state capital. And I was in the middle of my third year in school at the time, and walking around Mooresville, photographing everything for like just absorbing the whole thing for 2, 3 hours. I was asking myself, how did the old folks do this? Most of the people that settled in this place weren't even literate. So how could people that couldn't even read or write build a better place than all the great professionals of our day have done? And again, uh, this was before Seaside construction actually begun.
Mhm.
Um, and I couldn't answer that question, but the bigger question was, how did they then pass this great wisdom that let them do better than the professionals of our day have done? We now have computers, we got power tools, we got, all this stuff, um, that we that that how is that possible? But the greater mystery was, how did they pass that down to the next generation with no known artifacts to show for it? It wasn't like they had all these books that you can look up and say, this is exactly how we do. This is how a vernacular happens. That had to wait for Christopher Alexander. But
Mhm.
the I'm going to say this, and I'm no Einstein at all. But one thing I love that Einstein said, he said, I'm not that much smarter than other people. I just stick with problems longer. And so I took the mystery of Mooresville home with me, kind of fed it and watered it and gave it a place to live. And it was 24 years later. Now, if somebody had been brilliant, they'd have discovered this in 2 weeks. Okay. But 24 years later, as he had a charrette uh, for Lost Rabbit in Jackson, Mississippi, we had the celebratory dinner at the end of it. And then all the design team, we were all bidding goodbye to each other. And someone asked Milton Grenfell the fateful words. They said, Milton, how is it? Uh, why is it that you have all these bell cast eaves in this part of the country? Where it kicks out at the bottom. He said, well, we do this because that here, if your roof is too steep in a hurricane wind, it'll overturn. If it's too shallow, it'll fail an uplift. So the sweet spot is 8 and 12 to 9 and 12 in that vicinity. But if torrential rain comes off of that, it'll dig a trench in the yard. Um, Whereas if you kick it out, it comes off in more of a spray than a sheet,
Mhm.
and that's how it works out. Uh, and so I said, wait, what did he say? He said, we do this because that's it. That's it. That's the key of what I've been looking for all of those years, to try to figure it out. Because if you put the rationale of the patterns into the patterns, then it's easy to pass that down to the next generation and for people to actually improve it so it can actually become a living tradition. So, but backtracking then to the origins of Mooresville, then my graduation 2, 3 years later, uh, that the at that point when I got to Huntsville, Alabama, I interviewed in several places, but came back home because parents were still here, and at that time our oldest son Sam had been born, and so we basically returned home. But in Huntsville, everybody at that time, other than one really great architect that moved off to Atlanta shortly thereafter, it was pretty much, you know, working for wages. There was no interest in the urbanism. The architect I was working for, I told him about Seaside, and I thought he was going to fire me that day. He said, I'd bulldoze the whole thing and let my Cadillac drive around the corners at 35 miles an hour and put up condos that look like a Mondrian painting. So that's what I was faced with. There was no internet then. Um, and I totally lost contact with everyone that I had any contact with at all. And it got to the point a few years later, I wondered if I might be the only person left that actually cared about designing places people love. Um, and then in the mid 90s, I discovered what was then the excuse me, ICA, the Institute of Classical Architecture. There was a conference in New York City. I went to that. It's like, wow, there's more of us. I found my people. And then shortly thereafter, when Andres started doing the things at Seaside that you mentioned, the conferences, I started going there, and that was really the beginning of my involvement, direct involvement with the urbanism. And by that time, of course, the internet was around, and then you could create a lot of connections that way.
Yeah.
But for quite a long time, it was kind of like years in the wilderness, you might say. because
Yeah.
I thought I was the only one.
Let's speak a little bit more. I want to get to the original green here in a little bit, but let's talk a little bit about what you alluded to there with the living tradition. Your story reminds me of, one of Andreas's quotes, many quotes over the years that stuck with me, but one in particular was that um, it was amateurs who copied that built basically every place in the world that we really love. And it's the professionals of recent decades who have ruined our cities with their inventions. And I know that was something that I think really drove you to work on your Living Tradition series, which you're still working on. You should talk a little bit about what that means, and when people talk about living traditions or just traditions, how do you interpret that?
Well, there's two sides to tradition. One side, and the one that people think of the most, and that they think it's the only part of it, uh, is traditional style. You can talk about the vernacular style of a region, but it's not a true vernacular or living tradition at all. It's just simply a matter of style. And as a matter of fact, um, modernists rightly react poorly to the idea of having a style shoved down their throat. They want to be allowed to think. They want to be allowed to explore, as they should be. Um, and so, if it's a matter of a closed canon, effectively a style-based pattern book, and I've written quite a number of those back when I didn't know any better. I didn't know how to do something. Matter of fact, I remember being at a excuse me, at a CNU with there was a panel of several of us talking about pattern books, and one of them was Ray Gendros, who's kind of the grandfather of pattern books in the modern era. And I asked him partway through the discussion, I said, Ray, if someone picked up one of our pattern books in 50 years, how would anything they build according to the pattern book then be any different from what people build according to the pattern book today? And of course, the answer is it wouldn't be, because it's a book of rules, and you follow the rules, you get the same results. But then I said, what can we do to help architecture to live again as it has always lived? Is anyone with a copy of Bannister Fletcher, the big book, excuse me, I'm going to get a sip of water.
Sure.
Um, yeah, how can anybody with that book, and actually looking over here to see if I see it, I've got it here somewhere, but wherever it is, who can see that architecture has always evolved from the beginning of civilization until we started to have this series of little revolutions instead of evolution at the beginning of modernism. How can we help architecture to live again, to where it can actually start to learn from things today, and to improve things long known to work, as opposed to saying let's throw it all out and have my own artistic creation? And so that's been my goal for a very long time. And then the that discovery a couple of years after that of the four words of we do this because being the kind of the operating system of a true living tradition. Um, and that has changed everything since that time for me, because it just opens up so many doors where you're allowed to think about things like a tradition as an organic thing, as opposed to a mechanical thing where you just read the book and you follow the rules, kind of the old RTFM thing. No, it's not that. It's let architecture live, not RTFM.
Yeah. Yeah. So then at a point later on, or while this was going on, you started working on your thesis about the original green. So I think if people have heard of you and know about you in the larger world, they probably associate you more with the original green more so than anything else. What talk about for anybody who's not familiar, what is the original green? What's the sort of the short version of what it's all about, and what led you to thinking about these issues?
Well, the original green is what um, what kept humanity alive, really, from the dawn of civilization or the dawn of humanity uh, un, until really the beginning of the thermostat age, when we thought we could flip a switch and make everything okay, because of the machines. But before that, um, it was the assembled and improved wisdom of how to build and how to live in the places we built in such a way that things get better for us instead of us turning into ghosts and our town turning into a ghost town. And so um, and what I decided to do, because I've been a strong believer in a lot of the things that the urbanists have done and continue to do. Um, so I realized at the very beginning, when I was trying to assemble answers to that question in a systematic way, I said, I could make this thing an apology for the new urbanism, but I refuse to do that. I need to step back and think really kind of systematically about what is it that creates a sustainable place, and then sustainable buildings within that sustainable place. Uh, and and so I asked myself, well, let's talk about places. What's the number one thing about a place that if it isn't there, you can't live there? And the number one thing is, if you can't eat there, you won't live there. You won't last very long at all. You might last, depending on how much accumulated stored energy you have. Uh, you might last for a few months. If you're pretty fit and slim, you might last for a few weeks. But anyhow, of course, today we can, again, the machine allows us to ship in food from all around the world. But in a long emergency, as Jim Kunstler might say, um, you need to be able to look out onto the fields and onto the waters from which most of your food comes. Otherwise, life can't be sustained in the place. And so that seemed to me to be the first foundation of a sustainable place. And um, then you got to say, well, can I get around to my daily needs in a self-propelled way, either walking or cycling? Because again, it's saying, well, here's the thing: if in order to live in a place, if you have to be connected with pipes and wires to resources half a world away or whatever, then that place isn't a living place. It's like its own life support, because it's all got all the pipes and wires stuck into it. And so you got to be able to get around. So it's got to be accessible so you can get around easily to what you need without total dependence upon auto domination. Um, and then you need to be able to get those services. You don't want to just walk around in circles for exercise. You need to be able to get daily necessities. The two of those together, what they're now calling the 15-minute city. Can you get around all your daily needs in just a few minutes? And then the toughest question that people don't want to talk about uh, is, what about those inevitably less secure times in every city's future? If you cannot secure the most vulnerable parts of the urbanism, which are things like the middle of the block and so forth, where people can sneak in your back door or whatever, and uh, if you can't secure it more than it is today when everything is open, while still allowing people to walk up and down the streets, because if you shut off entire segments of the city, then that's what a ghetto basically is. And so those they're tough questions to ask and to answer there, but it's a conversation we have to have, because every city and every place in the city goes through inevitable cycles of more secure and less secure. So those four seem to me to be nourishable and accessible and serviceable and securable, the four most important foundations of a sustainable place. And then I got to thinking about, on the architectural side, what is the most important thing? And most everybody would say high energy efficiency. But really, if you think about it, if a building can't be loved, it won't last. As soon as the mortgage is paid off, we're going to get rid of it and do something
Mm-hmm.
else. Uh, and unfortunately, um, we've grown so accustomed to unlovable buildings that we built an entire culture of throwaway buildings where as soon as they're paid for, they're done. They're toast because they're regarded not as something to cherish, but just kind of as a cheap tool until its usefulness is over with. And so that seemed to me to be like the very first foundation. And then if it is uh, lovable, is it durable enough to carry that lovability long into an uncertain future? Because if it's not, if it's lovable but falls down next week, then I hope you took pictures, because that's all you'll have left. Um, and if it is lovable and durable, then is it adaptable enough to be many different things over time? One of the worst um, example or best examples actually of unsustainability is the old maxim of form follows function. Because if a building is so tightly tied to a single function, when that function is ended, the building is useless.
Mhm.
You got to tear it down and replace it with something else. And when you look at people today, and uh, I think they say today that a graduating student will probably do what is it, 4 or 5 different things over the course of their
Mhm.
lives, not just what they went to school for. And 2 or 3 or 4 of those things at graduation are disciplines that don't even exist yet. So they'll be doing things that hadn't been invented yet before they retire. So if life is changing that quickly, then an unadaptable building is guaranteed to be obsolete very quickly. Whereas one that is good architecture, that's loved and durable, and could be many different things, that it may last for centuries. It could be, as Clay Chapman talks about, a millennium building, that
Right.
is here in a 1,000 years. And
Right.
then if a building is lovable and durable and adaptable, but it's not frugal, then it's one of the worst things as well, because people join arms in front of the bulldozers and say, "Oh no, you don't," you know, because they love the place. And but even if it is an energy hog, and so it needs to really be all four. Now, the interesting thing is, those were the 8 foundations that existed in my mind when the book was published back in, what was it, 2010. And in the uh, but I came to realize in the process of doing the second edition of the book, A Living Tradition: Architecture of the Bahamas, I realized that I was missing an entire category uh, of of sustainability, and that is, if you think about Rome, which was the the greatest capital of the ancient world, uh, had many buildings in it that were sustainable, some of which still exist today, 2,000 years later. But uh, by the middle centuries of the medieval era, it had been reduced to a city of, I've been told, its low point was somewhere around 10,000 people, and and the garbage had piled up so high that I've seen I've seen pictures of women who were stringing clotheslines between the capitals of the Pantheon, of the front portico, because the garbage was up so high that the new street level was up close to the capitals. And so uh, so you can have a sustainable place with sustainable buildings within it, but if the society within that place is not sustainable, then it may still fall into ruin and to become a ghost town or close to it, um, as Rome even did, even though it was, like I say, the capital of the ancient world, really, for centuries. And so when I got to thinking about the thing, and again, stepping back, trying not to be an apologist for anyone, the new urbanism or whatever. So what are the 4 keys today of a sustainable society? And I thought, we're really today, the very first one has got to be education, because if someone comes to a new town and they have children, then the first thing they ask is, where's the best school districts? They don't want their kids to get a poor education, because they know how that limits them throughout life. Uh, And then the second foundation in my mind is the economy, and specifically uh, the economy not just as a capturer of outposts of
Hmm.
multinational corporations, but an economy that's actually building ideas and building stuff from their people in their place. Um, and and so that's got to be one too. And then the third would be culture, and not just again the ability to capture the big show that traveling around the country on a tour, but what kind of culture are you building locally in terms of not just the music, but the food, but the art, and all of these different aspects of culture. That what are you cultivating in your place? And then today, and this has got to be a new one, because when my grandparents were living on the farm, this was a non-issue because it was a part of your daily life. But the fourth foundation seems to me to be wellness. In other words, how much does your place foster wellness for people to actually, just by living there, not by going and buying a service in a building from a spa or a therapist or whatever, but just by living in the place, how much does it foster opportunities for wellness? And again, these four things, unlike the four foundations of both places and of buildings, which have been fairly steady over time, these four of society, actually, I think they change places, and some of them even fall off the charts. Like I say, the wellness one was not even on the charts
Right.
in 1940.
Hmm.
Because everybody working on the farms, that was their exercise.
Right.
And
Right.
so anyhow, that's so at this point in time, I feel like there's actually those 12 uh, uh, foundations of sustainability. And the one thing I should mention about frugality, going back to the buildings, there is an idea out there that I call gizmo green,
Hmm.
which is the proposition that with better equipment and better materials, we can achieve sustainability. By all means, let us have better materials and more efficient equipment. Why would you want less efficient equipment? Um, if I have to have equipment, if the building can't naturally condition itself, uh, on most days of the year, then if you're building in the Arctic or whatever, it won't. So you don't want to die, you don't want to freeze to death. So by all means, have efficient equipment there, and even in other places where you need equipment. But to think that that is the entire proposition of sustainability and ignore everything else is really missing the big picture. And so uh, that's so Gizmo Green does play a role. It's just a relatively small role. And as a matter of fact, I would suggest to you that all of these moves towards smarter this and smarter that are all a part of Gizmo Green. But in reality, the things that are about the built environment that are prefaced with the word smart are really designed to make the human stupid.
Yeah.
There was a movie called Idiocracy a few years ago that was not the whole story of Idiocracy, but that was a part of it, of let the machines think for you. And of course now with, what is it, Chat GPT or whatever,
Yeah.
uh, I'm wondering if that's the next phase of the Idiocracy, moving in to think for us. So
Yeah.
I don't know. Anyhow, but that's a tangent. Sorry.
Yeah, either that or ultimate path to become like the movie Wall-E, where we just kind of sit, and everything
Yes.
is given to us. Um, so, I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. One of the things that I really think about a lot, Steve, when I think about the original Green, just from the aspect of architecture, uh, the the uh, the first house that I ever purchased. And lived in was actually a triplex that was built in the very early part of the 20th century. It was actually built as a house and then carved up into three units in the Depression, one on each floor. So I lived on the second floor and then rented out the other two floors. The house did not have central air conditioning, because of course in that era they didn't have central air, and the heat was all radiator heat, hot water heat. And so whatever air conditioning was provided through window air conditioners. Um, what I found most interesting and fascinating about living in that house was, again, I was on the second floor, is I had good cross ventilation, and um, that house was very, very comfortable inside up to about, easily 90 degrees in the heat of the summer. It got over 90, and then I really felt like I had to turn on the window units, but up to 90. I almost always had good enough cross ventilation and high enough ceilings that it was very comfortable to live in. Um, and that was fascinating to me to think about, because that was all very low tech, obviously. So that kind of meet the definition of frugal. And it couldn't help but trigger in my mind that if I were following, for example, the contemporary standards for what to do, how to heat and cool that building, the answer or recommendation would be, a very high efficiency, contained unit, a very expensive unit, which would require a lot of regular maintenance and everything else, and really trying to seal the house up as much as possible. So I often felt like, a lot of what the interpretation or I got out of the original green, it was kind of a really elegant response to the LEED system, which came into effect in the 2000s and really took over the building professions. And I wondered about, how much of that was in your mind in sort of thinking about the various LEED strategies and trying to get people to think about it a different way.
LEED is uh, I've always considered myself a friendly adversary to the U.S. Green Building Council because of the fact I actually served on one of the committees for having to do with place for a year and a half or something like that. It was a while, um, and and the original green is clearly in my mind a counterpoint to LEED. It's saying, okay, what you do is important, but it's important in a very small uh, cell of the matrix, as opposed to the whole thing. Um, and and actually, to your example of being comfortable up until a certain temperature, we actually did down in Belize at a place called Mahogany Bay Village. We did uh, well. The whole place was done without a stitch of turf grass on the site, without a stitch of drywall on the walls. Um, and we had the little through the wall units, but because of the fact that the we had a reflective ceiling, or reflective roofing, excuse me, uh, and then there were high ceilings that the whole house could, or each of the houses could open up and breathe at night. Get the sea breeze coming through, and so you cool off nicely. And and I've actually been down there on quite a number of days and nights, and you could, if you close up the louvers by uh, by about 9 or 10 in the morning, something like that, um, then because it's reflective roofing, I have been there in days that that it's 100 degrees outside. That this is in the tropics. It's south of Cuba by a good little bit, and and I have had I cut the ceiling fan on around 11:30 or 12, kind of stir the air up, because with the ceiling fan, you can be comfortable 10 degrees warmer than you would be if it were, a still air. And so uh, the only time I've ever had to cut on the little through the wall unit was one night that Wanda and I were there, and it had rained all night, and so we couldn't open up the louvers to let it breathe. And so because they were closed, and so it was about 10 degrees warmer when morning came on the inside, then that meant that later on that day we actually had to cut the AC on. But working in Miami Beach for 17 years, I have literally many times in South Beach in July, yeah, I have opened up the windows, cut on the ceiling fan, and been perfectly comfortable in the city where the basketball team is named the Heat. Okay. And I've had people come down from other parts of the country, mainly in the South, where they're used to having air conditioning all the time, where you can't exist without it, or so we've told ourselves. And they've come down, and we'll be out in the side garden or walking down to Lincoln Road or whatever, or Ocean Drive, and they're just sitting there suffering. And we have a saying in North Alabama. I don't know why we say it because this doesn't exist, but we say they're sweating like a pig. Of course, as we know, pigs don't sweat. That's why they get in the mud and wallow around because that's their way of cooling off. And meanwhile, I'm sitting there and I'm totally comfortable because we spend enough time going around to our daily needs on foot or Wanda on her bike that we got totally acclimated. We moved down there in the fall and got totally acclimated during what they call winter, which just means when nobody has their AC on, because you don't need it. Uh, and and so I can accurately say that there was never a time in South Beach that I was ever outside and in the shade and in a breeze and ever uncomfortable. I just never
Yeah.
was.
Yeah.
17 years.
Yeah.
So, that's just really kind of key that all these things are supposed to be impossible. Well, they are if we're so fragile because we're in air conditioning all the time, we're driving all the time. Hence, we gain weight. All these things that happen as a result of being the children of the machines, if you will. Um, that but that's great fragility, and so one of the things we learned so much about down there was how to be resilient and adaptable, and that changes your life. It really does.
Yeah. And, I think one of the things that really strikes me about all this, about really so much of what you did in the original Green, whether you're talking about a place or a building or a community, there's a lot of great techniques in there that just normal, average people can actually take on themselves and do. And so it's great actionable advice for anybody. You don't have to be a professional in any field to do it, and to have a healthier building, to have a more energy efficient building, to have a better place, a better community. And that's really, again, that's something to me that really stands in contrast to the very highly technical, professionalized approach, really epitomized by LEED, but also common in a lot of our profession, and certainly in the smart city movement and the smart whatever movement that you referenced earlier. So um, I'm curious about when you were writing that, was that part of the thought process also, is to think about just like how somebody who's a non-professional, non-architect might what they might take away from that work.
Oh, absolutely. And that goes back to that first night when Wanda asked the question that changed my career about, you know, do you ever listen to the regular people? And so, you know, my thought long was since then, or it's long been, or it's forever been since then, of if I can't speak in a way that anyone on the street can understand, I'm probably going to have a very small audience, and so do very little good. And so, uh, the real goal has always been to be able to put things out that can spread on their own long after we are gone. Um, there are proverbs, uh, both biblical proverbs and many other proverbs, Aesop's fables and all this, that some of which date back 2.5, 3,000 years, that are still around because they were distilled down enough to be something that can take on a life of its own and spread. Like the Emancipation Proclamation was what I think it can be said in like 6 tweets, something like that. And it was 100 and something words, I forget. But but anyhow, it lasted 2-3 minutes. Do you know there was another guy speaking that day after Abraham Lincoln? He
Mm-hmm.
droned on for 2.5 hours, and not only does nobody have any idea what he said, they don't even know who he was. They didn't even know he existed, quite frankly. If you ask people today, who else spoke that day? They said, "Well, it's Abraham Lincoln." No, who else? I don't know. You know, and so um, so distillation is a key to me to distill things down to a very simple way to where they can spread. As a matter of fact, if you can't distill them down, you probably don't understand the idea well enough yet. You know,
Mm-hmm.
so for me, and I'm going to throw something in on new media, and I know there's a lot of controversy about this today, But Twitter has been a great tool for me because it forces you to have to distill things down in a way that is easy to be understood. Because there's a character limit. I understand it may be going up soon, but that's a different story. But so to me, that has been a great tool. Um, and and actually, my very first speaking gig was at the beginning of Gorham's Bluff in North Alabama. And Nathan Norris, our friend, uh, I was 10 minutes into it, and he gave me the hook. He said, "No, no, that's enough. That's enough." Because he said you were speaking in such complex ways that nobody, their eyes were glazing over. So since then, it literally has been a mission for me to try to distill things down to where they can be understandable to spread. So
Yeah.
anyhow, that
No, I appreciate that. And, two things come to mind. One is, that work of distilling things down to the average person really was never something we were sort of given much appreciation for as young people when we were educated. But those architects and designers who have learned how to do that have had remarkable success. I think about Sarah Suzanka and her Not So Big House books, for example. Even Bob Stern and others who've done a really great job. Um, so let's talk a little bit about. We can finish here by talking a little bit more about new media and social media. So one thing that I know and really appreciate about you is you've always been interested to kind of embrace new ways to communicate, really much more so than even a lot of our friends and colleagues. What is it that has pushed you into just new media environments and whether that's Twitter now or other things that blogging or other things that we've looked at in the past?
well, there's a couple of things. One, it always seemed to me to be a great tragedy that the high level discourse of the new urbanism has always happened behind the tall garden walls of private listservs. And so
Mm-hmm.
you have all this great discussion that never gets out. As a matter of fact, some people on the listservs would be very, very offended if you were to take something they said there and put it out. You can't put it out with attribution, otherwise, that's a problem. Um, and so it's like this wisdom that is put out that very few people ever hear likely will not have a long shelf life because there's no shelf to set it on. It's kind of almost spoken into the air and then it's gone. I mean, there's still emails, but still, that those eventually something happens and a hard disk dies or something like that. So I've tried to be a person that will distill and put out the ideas as best I can, so that they have a longer shelf life and so they can do good even after we're gone. That really is one of my great hopes is to be able to be a helper in having good ideas last longer. But here's the other thing: the original Green Book. Um, when I started writing it, it was on the Original Green blog, which started up in
Mm-hmm.
2008, so a couple years earlier. and and back in those days, a lot of people would comment on blog posts. Now they don't do so much, but or at least in my experience, they don't. But uh, that became a much better book because of actually, just as most of the genes in your body are not human genes, they're human genes in your body are about 1% of the total gene pool. The rest of them are in the uh, the biome and in the what is it called, microphages, I believe, and those are actually very, very ancient genes. But anyhow, so in like manner to that, most of the good ideas in the original Green Book were not my ideas, but I would put out an idea, kind of as Andreas calls it, red meat, uh, and then see what comes. And so most of the ideas were responses to stuff I put out that really kind of expanded my thinking. That had I just focused on staying in my own little corner, you know, it would have been the book would have been much poorer idea-wise and much less helpful. And so that's the other motivation, not only getting the great ideas out there that I hear other people talk about, but helping to refine my own work by engaging other folks and opening up. And I think it's incredibly important to say to, to yourself that it is my purpose to put out half-baked, unfinished ideas. Because if you do the old corporate way and wait until you have the grand product reveal until you think it's perfect, then, what are you going to say about that? But
Yeah.
if it obviously needs help, if you say, well, there's a core of a great idea, but man, you need to think about this part because you ain't even considered that yet, you know, then if you put them out in that state, then you're almost kind of like crowdsourcing
Yeah.
help because people will jump in then if they see it being imperfect but compelling.
Yeah.
It's almost like an infant or a young child. They're very weak, but we fall in love with them, and so we do things to help them along the way. So it's kind of like that.
Yeah. And I find with my own usage on social media that probably the majority of what I do is just something that's partially baked that I'm just putting out there, and it just try to see if there's any kind of reaction, positive or negative to it. And that has actually incredible value in that, because you do get a reaction and feedback. And I think probably too many people focus on the idea of those outlets being a place to argue or discuss and have a back and forth, which they're not good at. It's just not a productive way to spend your time at all. And you'll probably make yourself crazy pretty quickly if that's what you use it for. But as a way to test ideas, to put something out there and see who it connects with and who it doesn't, they can be really useful. Um, I have, we mentioned this on the New Urban Guild listserv, which is one of those private listservs. But I have really appreciated how you've been using Twitter, especially in the last year or so. Why don't you talk just for a minute about what has prompted you to take a different approach on Twitter and how that's gone for you?
What I've done in the last little over a year is I've I've noticed how that the tweets that actually get a lot more traffic are not just the ones where someone is putting out a proverb, if you will, or just an idea, but it's the ones that actually have a compelling image that they're saying something about them. And I've been photographing great places for decades now, and so I really, it was back during 2020 that had some time on my hands, and so I started going through and trying to catalog what to organize some of my photos in different ways. And then I said, what if I took like all the 4 stars and 5 stars? I had this 5-star rating system, and what if I started saying, what is the story behind this image? And then put the image out with the story as a tweet. And then that really started to pick up all kinds of traffic. And just in the last 6 to 8 months, well, dating back to mid-year last year, yeah, I guess it is somewhere in that vicinity. I realized that well, first of all, if you put out an entire stream of tweets all at once, that's too much to digest. But for me to properly tag a an image with all the keywords that it needs for searching, and then to be able to say what is the compelling story of this, and then write the story, that can be 10 minutes or so to do that, or maybe even 15 sometimes. And so, but what you can do is if you have a tweet, then there's a place where it says add another tweet. So you add that other tweet and it becomes part of the thread, but it's
Mm-hmm.
not coming out in a fire hose. It's coming out in little dribbles that people can say, oh, that's good. And then sometimes I have some of these now that I've discovered that some of them are 3 or 4 months long. And people still on things I post today are going back and reading the whole thing.
Yeah.
I've got one that's called the Downtown Top 10. It's the top 10 things to do if you want to help your downtown recover, uh, none of which are the normal advice. In other words, it's all stuff that people should have thought about already, and I've been trying to put out. But so those are some of the recent evolutions. What I find now is that some of those may end up being assemblable into whatever the next form of the book looks like that I'm trying to figure out right now. How can I make sense of starting with little bites, and then you put them together into a meal, and then you put them together into a feast. Um, and I don't know exactly where that's going yet, but that's one of those things of trying to find needs that aren't being met and fill those needs.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. I've tried to do a bit of the same too, but I haven't done it with the regularity you have. And it's a great way for all of us in our very small insular world to try to reach a much broader audience, to hopefully open some eyes and challenge some thinking, and also have our thinking be challenged by others, because we certainly have our dogmas that need to be challenged too. Steve, this has been really great. We'll have to find a time in the future to do it again at
I'd
some
love to.
point. Yeah. Before we go, I want to ask you. So this is the Messy City podcast. That's something I write about. That's what my site and blog is titled. I like to think about messy cities as places that are more sort of organic and informal, or have grown incrementally over years. When you think about that, what do you have a place that immediately comes to mind that you love that you think people should know about?
You know, of everything that would qualify for that term, I think the place that would wear that term most proudly would have to be New Orleans. And there's so many things you can see there that that if start out literally incrementally or in a tactical fashion, that that then grow into things that can then be loved and preserved for centuries. And nothing about that place is perfect. It's messy at every turn, uh, but it's so endearing. You just have to
Yeah.
fall in love with the place. Matter of fact, we were just down there for my birthday at the end of December, and love it every time. And it
Hmm.
just yeah, that I can't think of a better place that would qualify. Uh, for the term messy city, but endearing city is
Yeah.
New Orleans.
Yeah, arguably the greatest city in America. Absolutely love it. Steve, where can people find you if they want to search you out?
Really, these days, um, the we're working towards kind of getting everything on originalgreen.org. I used to have a whole bunch of sites, but I'm trying to be more lean about that and just say the most important things in one place as opposed to having stuff scattered all over.
Great, great. And your Twitter handle is what?
It's just Steve Mouzon.
All
It's just me with an at in front.
all right, perfect. All right, Steve, thanks so much. We'll talk to you again.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it.